We've all seen those pictures of buildings that 3/4 of it is above ground, but 1/4 of it is below ground. This is what this video is really about. But there are some reasons why we've had to make things, like these were made to go from on the cliffs down to the beaches. These were made because the land has hills, and then it has flatter land and hills and flatter lands, and this is what I think has happened. What it is when I went on the train, it was obvious to see there from Mickey's going back to London. It was going flat land, hill, not big ones, but just flat land, mound, houses down here, houses up there, houses down here, houses up there. And I think when they were making the road, they just made one level. And if your flat or house was below that bit, then that bit went below the bit. I think that's what they did with some of the roads. It's not all mud flooding. It's about making roads and making a straight, flat road. And then they have to cut through the hills and the buildings. I think that's maybe, if you get my gist. I've forgotten what I was going to say, but there are tunnels everywhere. You will find that there's Turkey, there's 7 underground cities, there's more, there's loads of places. These ones are in the UK, they're under York, and you see they're starting to say subterranean, which is mentioned in this video. And also, the deepest tube is the mail train. It goes below everything else, and it was one of the first things built. So how could that happen, that they could build that deep and make it so precise? It's now a museum. Anyway, let's carry on with the video, because there are some reasons, and I also have put videos out about Great Flood. You know, that happened because what it was is some electrical arkings happened, and it pushed the Himalayas up, and on top of the Himalayas was a sea, and this sea went all down the Himalayas, down into China, all down into the Middle East, right across to Portugal, took the top part of Africa, took all the Middle East. You can almost see, on Google Maps, you can see the swells on the Middle East, and it stopped in Portugal. It caused the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and another sea, I can't remember what it is, with the boom, 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 as the electric arkings are passing. It was happening on the Himalayas, it was happening in Italy with the electrical arkings. Think of the tsunamis, the earthquakes, think of other lands taken in America, all over Europe. It nearly annihilated us. That did, that one. But I can't say when it was. But you can see it on Google Maps, what's happened. I've made videos about it. But anyway, so that's some different thoughts, but let's carry on with the videos. These people are talking about why, what, and how.
I didn't set out to question the foundations of our cities. I was researching Victorian-era construction techniques, examining old photographs of urban development, trying to understand how rapidly industrializing societies built so much so quickly. Standard architectural history, nothing controversial. In photograph after photograph across dozens of cities, the same peculiar feature kept appearing. Ground-level windows half buried, ornate architectural details disappearing into sidewalks. Elaborate stonework cut off at street level, as if the buildings had been pushed down into the earth. Not in one city, not in one region, everywhere. The official explanation is straightforward. Streets were raised for sanitation and flood control. Cities built up their roads, burying the original ground floors. It happens, it's documented. Except when you look closer, the explanation starts to fracture. Because these aren't crude first floors that were buried, these are architectural masterpieces.
When I first began researching the strange urban transformations of the mid-1800s, I expected nothing unusual. Just the standard explanations every textbook repeats: industrial expansion, messy city planning, poor drainage, and the usual narratives historians use to explain the chaos of growing cities. But within the first week of digging through old engineering reports, city maps, and early photographs, something felt off. Not slightly off, completely out of place. Because between 1840 and 1880, across dozens of cities on multiple continents, the same impossible pattern shows up again and again. Entire neighborhoods suddenly appear half buried in dense, compacted earth.
Buildings with basement windows more elaborate than most modern buildings, structural systems engineered with precision that shouldn't exist in that era, and all of it, according to the standard timeline, was built specifically to be buried almost immediately. Why would anyone do that? Let's start with what we can observe directly. In Seattle, an entire district lies beneath the current street level. In Chicago, miles of tunnels connect buried first floors. In Edinburgh, whole streets exist underground, complete with storefronts and residential spaces. Portland has its Shanghai tunnels. Rome, its multiple buried cities stacked vertically through history. Standard urban archaeology, you might say. Cities build on top of themselves, nothing unusual there, except the timeline is wrong. These aren't ancient Roman ruins buried by centuries of gradual accumulation. These are sophisticated 19th century structures, buried within decades of their construction. In some cases, within years. Buildings that appear in photographs as street-level structures then reappear 20 years later, half submerged, with no documentation of why or how the streets rose several meters. The deeper I looked, the more the pattern repeated, not just in America or Europe, but worldwide. In Asia, in South America, in Africa, cities separated by oceans supposedly developed independently, all showing the same architectural signature, the same buried windows, the same half-submerged ground floors, the same absence of documentation explaining why functional buildings were deliberately entombed.
Half buried in dense, compacted earth. Not worn down, not flooded, not eroded over centuries. Buried, abruptly, uniformly, in a way no natural flood has ever behaved. The official explanations appear logical at first. Cities raise their streets. Drainage issues cause soil buildup. Sanitation reforms required new ground levels. But when you line up the data from Paris, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, Chicago, Vienna, Boston, Turin, San Francisco, a problem appears. All of these cities supposedly raised their streets at almost the exact same time, 1840 to 1880, and all absorbed nearly identical depths of earth. 2 meters here, 3 meters there, sometimes more. Independent cities, different climates, different technology levels, yet the same outcome. That was the moment I realized this wasn't urban planning. This wasn't coincidence. It looked like a global event. The photographs tell the story better than any archive. Doorways sitting 2 floors below the new street windows, peeking out from under packed layers of soil. Entire facades cut in half by raised groundwork crews digging downward. Not upward scaffolding built only to reach new, artificially elevated streets. And remember, these were not abandoned ruins. People were living in these cities while this was happening. Daily life continuing above a buried world. As I cross-checked more cities, I noticed something even stranger. The architecture beneath the mud often looks older, more refined, and more precise than the architecture built above it. Massive stone arches, perfect symmetry, foundations deeper and cleaner than anything expected from mid-1800s craftsmen. Why would entire cities bury floors that were structurally sound? Why raise streets instead of removing the sediment? Why do the earliest photographs ever taken appear right when cities were digging themselves out. The deeper I went, the clearer something became. The official story does not match the physical evidence. Engineering logs from the 1850s mention unexpectedly deep foundations, unmapped subterranean rooms, walls thicker than construction records indicate, ancient stone layers beneath planned excavation zones, and in the margins of several documents, a word appears quietly, not dramatically, not in conspiracy theory style, just small, subtle references. Tartarian. Old foundations, Tartarian origin, structure older than recorded. Not enough to make a claim, but enough to raise a question. Were these cities uncovering something they didn't build? Because when you zoom out across continents, a pattern emerges. The buried floors match each other. The window ratios match each other. The stone symmetry matches each other. The depth of the mud layer matches each other. Even when the cities themselves had no shared architects, no shared governments, no shared technology. Which leads to the central idea of this new, expanded investigation. The idea my previous video only touched on. What if the 1840s weren't just a period of modernization, but a period of excavation? Not building upward, but digging downward. Not creating new streets, but uncovering old ones. Not inventing cities, but recovering them. What if the mid-1800s were the aftermath of a global event that buried an older architectural world, and what we call street raising was actually Operation Unearthing, the coordinated recovery of whatever the mud had buried? Before we open the engineering maps, before we compare the identical excavation practices across continents, before we examine the architectural signatures that point to something older than the 19th century.
If you're finding this exploration valuable, consider how rarely these patterns are examined together. Each city's buried architecture is treated as a local curiosity, never connected to the global phenomenon. That isolation of evidence is worth questioning. The strangest part isn't that buildings were buried. Cities do rise over time. The strange part is the architecture itself. These buried levels weren't simple basements or service floors. They were primary entrances. They were elaborate public spaces. They featured architectural details that required significant investment and craftsmanship. And according to the official narrative, they were all designed and built knowing they'd be buried almost immediately. That's not how construction works. That's not how economics works. That's not how human behavior works. This is where Tartarea enters the investigation, not as a definitive answer, but as a framework for organizing the anomalies. And around the same period, architectural patterns shift dramatically worldwide. Suddenly, cities everywhere begin constructing buildings with nearly identical design principles. Not similar, identical. The same proportions, the same structural logic, the same ornamental vocabulary. This happens across continents in regions with supposedly no contact, using construction techniques that official history describes as newly invented. Could these buildings represent inherited technology? Architecture built according to design principles and construction techniques that weren't invented but rediscovered or repurposed? Structures that may have been completed, occupied briefly, then partially buried during some unrecorded cataclysm or systematic campaign of concealment. I'm not claiming this is what happened. I'm asking if the evidence pattern fits better with this interpretation than with conventional explanations. Let's examine what actually exists. Not speculation, not theory. Physical evidence you can verify yourself. First, the photographs. In city after city, historical photographs show buildings at different ground levels than they stand today. Not slight variations, differences of 3, 4, sometimes 6 meters. The photographs are dated and catalogued. The buildings are identifiable. The ground level has demonstrably changed. Yet documentation explaining why this happened, when it happened, and how it was accomplished is consistently absent or inadequate. Standard explanations cite street raising projects, but the projects themselves are poorly documented. No comprehensive engineering plans survive for most cities. No detailed cost accounting. No contemporary newspaper coverage proportional to what would have been massive infrastructure undertakings. The projects that supposedly transformed entire urban landscapes left barely any administrative trace. Second, the buildings themselves. Look at the structural engineering. Many feature load-bearing walls that make no sense if the current ground level was the intended design. Support columns that terminate at what is now underground, as if they were designed for a different elevation. Drainage systems that flow upward from current street level. Ventilation systems positioned below ground that would have been functional only if the street level were lower. These aren't design mistakes. These are systematic features suggesting the buildings were engineered for a ground plane several meters below current street level. Third, the buried spaces themselves. When you can access them through basement conversions or urban exploration, you find something remarkable. Not crude storage areas, not unfinished basements, fully realized architectural spaces, finished walls, decorative elements, features that indicate these were meant to be occupied, seen, experienced as primary spaces.
Now, as I kept digging into the records of 1840 to 1880, one question refused to go away. What exactly were they unearthing, and why was the world so quick to cover it back up? When I expanded the research beyond a handful of cities, something became immediately obvious. This wasn't an isolated problem, and it wasn't a collection of local urban reforms. It was a pattern so consistent, so mathematically precise, that the official explanations started to collapse the moment the data was placed side by side. Because once you line up the records from Paris, Chicago, Warsaw, Vienna, Boston, San Francisco, Istanbul, Melbourne, and St. Petersburg, you begin to see the same sequence repeated almost point for point. 1. A sudden appearance of compacted earth measuring between 2 and 4 meters in depth. 2. Lower floors instantly becoming unusable. 3. Streets raised upward rather than sediment removed downward. 4. Excavation teams documenting older architecture beneath the new city. 5. And then a strange silence in the historical record. What struck me immediately was how synchronized these transformations were. These cities had different governments, different climates, different geological conditions, and different levels of industrial development. Yet every one of them entered a massive street-raising phase within the exact same 40-year window. That isn't natural development, that is coordination, or reaction. But reaction to what? As I sifted through engineering logs and municipal notes, a key detail kept reappearing, almost in passing. Almost as if the writers were trying not to draw attention to it. Unexpectedly deep foundations discovered, substructure older than documented plans, arches and windows found below recorded floor level, rooms identified beneath original ground layer. None of these comments were expanded on. They were treated as nuisances, obstacles to construction, footnotes in the margins. But when you collect all the footnotes from around the world, they tell a completely different story. Because these deep foundations weren't crude, they weren't unstable, they weren't proto-industrial, they were advanced. Stonework cut with precision that outperformed the tools of the 1840s. Arches too large to be functional basements. Columns whose geometry matched buildings supposedly constructed centuries later. Window frames buried so deeply that their original purpose became impossible to explain through the conventional timeline. And the strangest detail of all, none of these structures were built to be underground. Every architectural feature showed signs of normal, above-ground use. Weathering patterns, soot marks, and wear lines at what used to be ground level, which leads to only one reasonable conclusion. They weren't designed as basements. They became basements, buried by something that cities did not publicly acknowledge, yet all responded to. When I compared the photographic evidence, the consistency became even more jarring. In every city, work crews were digging down, not building up. They weren't constructing new floors, they were uncovering old ones. Yet the official paperwork labeled all of this as modernization, sanitary improvement, regrading, street elevation. It didn't matter which city, the phrasing was nearly identical, as if copied from the same template. That was my first major red flag, because independent cities don't write the same excuses unless they are all trying to avoid referencing the same event.
And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore. The sediment, the material burying these structures, isn't gradual urban accumulation, decades of trash and organic buildup compressing into soil. It's meters of mud, sand and clay deposited rapidly. Geological layers that suggest catastrophic deposition, not slow urban development. In some locations, the buried levels show signs of having been flooded, filled with sediment, then abandoned. Not gradually covered over generations, but buried suddenly. Now we arrive at the central mystery. Even accepting the official narrative, even assuming all these street-raising projects happened exactly as described, you're still left with an impossible coordination problem. How did dozens of cities across multiple continents, supposedly developing independently, all decide to raise their street levels within the same narrow time window?